So, today we are going to be talking about openness to experience, which is the sixth and final factor in the HEXACO personality model. Openness to experience, as the name suggests, is a factor about being open-minded, about being intellectually curious, about being imaginative, about exploring the world. It's related to intelligence, but it's not quite the same thing. It definitely correlates with intelligence, but openness to experience as a personality factor is more about a preference for acquiring knowledge, while IQ is about the actual ability, how much you know and how well you are at using what you know. So it's important not to conflate the preference with the actual ability. Now, of course, both of those can be worked on as people expand in IQ. Sometimes they can increase in openness to experience, and sometimes when people are moving through openness, they can have an effect on their own IQ just in the act of learning more. However, that doesn't always happen, and it's very possible to be high IQ but low openness, such as Jordan Peterson, or the reverse, very high openness while low IQ, which is something hippies have often been stigmatized for. So, correlation is not causation. Openness is related to intelligence, but just because they tend to go hand in hand doesn't mean they always will. So there are, as with the other factors, four sub-factors that have to do with openness to experience. The first is aesthetic appreciation, which is about enjoyment of beauty in art and nature. So people who are high in aesthetic appreciation are going to be trying to find the beauty in everything. Everything in the perspective of someone high in that sub-factor will seem vibrant and colorful, even if to other people, it seems like, oh my God, how can you find this interesting? Someone who is high in aesthetic appreciation is going to be constantly um, just looking at absolutely everything, regardless of where they are. They could be in the middle of a homeless encampment, and they'd probably still find aesthetic appreciation. I mean, depending on exactly how high they are in this subfactor, they'd be able to find things that are remarkable or fanciful in it. Maybe pieces of art the homeless people made, or um, I don't know exactly what. Maybe that wasn't the best example, but you get the idea. The second subfactor is called inquisitiveness. Inquisitiveness is a tendency to seek out information about the world. So this is more about the gaining information and knowing aspect of openness to experience. So people who are scientifically inclined, people who do research, people like me who can spend hours and hours and hours on Wikipedia just looking up stuff. It doesn't have to be about like real world stuff either. It can be, just looking up stuff about things in fictional worlds, looking up stuff about a video game world, which is some things I often do. It's people who want to gain information. Um, so it's and also people who are one manifestation of this is people who are high in the sciences, or people who are very nerdy. Those people are going to tend to be high in inquisitiveness. The third subfactor in openness to experience is called creativity. Creativity is probably a fairly self-explanatory one, but I'll explain it anyway. So this is people who have a preference for doing new things, for innovation, for experiment, for uh, people who want to make entirely new things out of stuff that's lying around, make new gadgets, invent new designs, new contraptions. Uh, for people who are high in creativity, the status quo is never the way things should be. People who are very creative, they'll always be coming up with various new. I don't know why I'm having such trouble explaining this one. Um, it's like the simplest. uh, People who are creative. Anyway, moving on. Maybe I'll come back to that one, but moving on for now. Unconventionality. So unconventionality is it's a tendency for people to become outliers within society, and just outliers generally. So people who are unconventional, they'll be uh, they'll be beating to their own drum. They'll always, regardless of what other people are doing, they'll always be wearing whatever they want to wear. Um, it's not necessarily a want to be different. I mean, sometimes it can be people who want to be different, but oftentimes it's just people whose tastes are uncorrelated with that of society. So people who are wearing uh, novel, fanciful sorts of things, people who have certain tastes. Um, the society might be doing one thing, social media might be doing one thing, but people who are high in unconventionality will be doing something completely different, just whatever they want to be doing. One thing about all of these, like the higher in openness you are, there's a tendency for um, fantasy, and a tendency for um, I don't know why I'm having such trouble explaining this. Yeah, there's a tendency for um, the people who are high in openness. They see the way the world could be, not just the way the world is. I'll put it that way. And that's sort of something that it's in creativity, it's in unconventionality, it's in aesthetic appreciation and inquisitiveness. People who are into science fiction and fantasy in general, I would say, tend to be high in openness to experience, because they're people who tend to live in their heads. People who uh, it's all about possibility. People who are constantly playing with ideas. They're playing with, what if we actually lived in a fantasy world, coming up with entirely new worlds, which is actually something that's become rather commonplace in fiction now in the modern day. Didn't used to be like this, but just as society has become more conscious, it's open-mindedness is a part of that. Um, and so, oh, there's a cat behind me. I apologize for my stumbling. I did not expect to have such trouble explaining this. It's actually really clear in my head, but for some reason I'm just having difficulty getting it in words. Um, yeah, well, I think you get the idea. What one way you can tell if someone is high in openness just generally is if they're into science fiction and fantasy, if they're into science, if they're into things that could be in general. Um, Now, contrasting that with low openness to experience, people who are low in openness, they tend to be by the book, traditional, set in their ways, tend to look at what's right in front of them, tend to be absolutistic. Conservatives are a very good example of what that looks like, just generally it's always about it's not something high in the sky. It's always some literal physical thing that they have in mind. Or, I mean, one exception is, just like societal values. I suppose those, strictly speaking, aren't physical things, but uh, uh, the way that society has been doing things is the way uh, it's the way things need to be, and people who are low in openness will see that as being it happened this way because this is the best way and this is who we are, that kind of thing. I'll go more into this as we go through the episode. Um, So one thing I wanted to mention is relating this to another model that I have done a series on, which is spiral dynamics. And as people move up the stages in spiral dynamics, they tend to linearly increase in openness to experience. So I'm about to go into the different regions for openness, which I have compiled just like I did for the other factors. And as I go through those, you're going to start to notice certain parallels between certain stages in spiral dynamics. I will not be referencing specifically which stages, because after all, openness to experience is its own thing and spiral dynamics is its own thing. But those of you who've watched the Spiral Dynamics series, or also those of you who just happen to know about spiral dynamics from the get-go, are definitely going to pick up on which which regions correspond to which stages. So now we're going to begin with so down at -3, which is what I refer to as superstition-oriented. So the -3 region is these are the people who they don't even really see the world the way it is. It's the way that their mind pretends that it is. For someone who's superstition oriented, there's going to be a sort of magical quality to everything. They'll be, as the name suggests, extremely superstitious. They'll be afraid of entities that their mind has constructed. For example, they'll imagine that certain inanimate objects might be alive and that they need to appease those objects, and they'll be afraid of breaking the status quo of their little group, because they'll be afraid that that entity might do something to them. It's very hard to talk to these sorts of people down in -3 directly, because they tend to have circular thinking of, we have to do this because of something bad is going to happen if we don't. Some and you're like, what? Why is something bad going to happen? And it's because, well, we might not have done that certain ritual. And it's like, well, why didn't you do that certain ritual? And it's, oh, because that certain bad thing happened, and it goes around and around and around in a circle. Is this sort of circular thinking, and the thinking that also tends to be animistic. People who are that close-minded, they won't really recognize that there's like individual people. It's instead of saying, the crows did something, it's crow did something. And this is something you see in a lot of very old traditions. This sort of failure to understand that there's like different individuals that contribute to something. Instead, it's that group is its own single entity, just like their own group is its own single entity. So that's sort of how these people think. Moving up to -2, which is called nationalist. So the nationalists are people who that they still see their nation as their own entity, but now they are willing to admit the existence of individuals. And in the thinking of these people, it's all about what is it that makes our group different from the other groups. and they'll be doing absolutely anything to support their particular group. Um, the way that things are done is going to be seen for the -2 as being the absolute. Now, it's not the only this isn't the only region that sees the absolute. The one above it also thinks in absolutes, but it does so a bit differently. This isn't quite conformity yet. Conformity implies a choice that you could conform or not conform, and that's the one above nationalism. With nationalism, there isn't really a choice for that yet. It's this is our group, and it's always been our group, and that stuff that's out there, it's all bad because it's different, and they'll never give the stuff out there a chance. If you even bring up the topic of conformity, the very idea that someone might not conform, that someone might not have the rules of their own society, will be seen as horrifying to someone in the -2 region. So it's not really even offering a choice. But on the other hand, they do understand that there are individuals within the group. They do have a sense of self. So moving up to -1. Now -1 is the conformist, and the conformist is someone who's sort of like they're sort of like a puzzle piece looking for the right shaped hole. They are that they're going to find a certain group if they don't already have one, and they're going to seek belonging within that group. It's not in a strictly absolutistic sense, although it can be, but it's more once they find a group, they're going to become very loyal to that particular group. And their real want is to help that group form a society. Pardon me. So these people are they're what's often called role based. They're aware that other groups are out there, and they're aware that people have real choices in developing those groups, and because of that, they are trying to create things that set their group apart from other groups, and once they join something, they're going to be coming up with all the best traditional excuses for why that group is better than the other groups. It's not a strictly national sense. It's just, that they see it as their own personal duty to support that particular group. Now, one interesting caveat here is that when people are conforming, they can conform at being a nonconformist. They can play at being liberal while in fact being rather conservative about how they are liberal. You can have people who conform at being a goth, for example. That would be an example of a conformist who's playing at being something higher. So it's a little bit more complex than just being traditional, because that there are some closed-minded people who can try to conform at being open-minded. So anyway, moving on to the one that's the balanced state. Now, when I say balanced state, it's a little more nuanced than the other factors, because this is the of all the factors, openness to experience is definitely the factor where there's the most leeway for movement. It's not quite as set as the others between +3 and -3 of, humans are naturally wired this way. Actually, just as humans evolve and become more conscious, they will tend to become more open-minded. And so, in the old world, if you look at some other factor like the H factor or conscientiousness or emotionality, those are going to be more or less the same. I mean, well, okay, they're probably a bit lower in H2, but with openness to experience, there'd be an even more profound difference, which is that people in the olden days, even just like 100 years ago, would have been significantly more closed-minded. There's been more studies done on that with IQ than openness, but it is definitely something you can see with openness as well. Um, uh, to use IQ, I think it was, what was it, 70 years ago in the, or 80 in the 1940s, that people, the average IQ back in those days would have been 85. If those people were to take the same IQ test that we use today, the average for 1940s would have been 85. So people gained IQ. And every decade that goes by, people tend to gain a few more IQ points. It's called the Flynn effect. That's not the same as openness to experience, but unfortunately, there haven't been quite as many studies done on openness. So uh, I'm using IQ here as a bit of a proxy. But openness to experience does behave quite similarly, and if you have any doubt about that, then just research how things were even just 100 years ago, and you realize they have very different values than what we have today. They were very traditional compared to us. Anyway, we're still on the continuums now in the balanced state. So in the balanced state, we have what's called rational. So people who are rational, they're no longer concerned with being conformist. They are now trying to explain everything, trying not necessarily in a very wise kind of way, but they're trying to explain why things are the way they are. As they're breaking out of the conformity stage, they're uh, they're sort of like conforming uh, at trying to explain the world. So it's going to start off as being well, of course, the way we were doing things is the best, but as they start to become more and more of a rationalist, they'll sort of become their own sort of independent entity. Uh, People who are in this region tend to see the material world as sort of like a big machine. Everything is to be explained with purely numerical models. They might not understand why those models behave the way they do, but they're trying to find sense by just being very statistical and being very scientific. People in this region, they'll they want to think of themselves as open-minded, but they're really not that much. Um, it's common for a lot of new atheists to be rationalists of, well, I am open-minded. I'll allow for a 1% chance that maybe God does exist, but realistically speaking, it's very unlikely. So they'll sort of be like that. They'll have a sort of set way for how the world works. Um, and use that to pretend at being open-minded. But when they're trying to go around explaining the world, they sort of have their own schema in mind, and they'll try to rationalize everything with respect to that schema. So for people in this region, it's a lot of like engineers tend to commonly fall in this region. People who like to work with like physical objects, like actually building machines, programmers, are very rationalist. People, this region, it works very well for people who want to view the world as sort of like just a big machine where everything is a computer, because it doesn't really require you to think about why people are the way they are, and they can sort of shove that off of oh, we're all machines anyway. We're all if you strip us down to the very bare minimum, then you'll realize that we're all just like clockwork things. We're all atoms, and if you look a little bit more, then we're all just like these purely mechanical cells. It's it might be biological, but it's still a machine. That's sort of how these people think. I think I've conflated enough onto this one. We should move on. So moving up to extracultural. So plus one region is the extracultural. And extracultural is people who have finally started to become a little bit curious about why it is that people are the way that they are. So this is now people who are into people science, such as personality models, people who are into relationships, and they're starting to realize, these social systems we have, they're made out of people. They're not made out of things. and we might want to start caring about the people now. Now, of course, there's more going on in that sort of stage besides openness, so I'm going to focus on openness part of it because of this own episode, but just be aware that there's definitely more going on with that particular stage in spiral dynamics than just openness. But anyway, for extracultural, it's about people who are now trying to experiment with why social systems happen the way they did, are social systems fair, um, people who they'll be interested in what other cultures are doing. They're going to be studying a lot of different world languages, going to be looking at a lot of different world traditions and trying to, investigate, how they developed. People who they're going to be trying to go around and do a lot of traveling because they want to experience the rest of the world. And in their mind, there's no real definite preference between their culture and anyone else's culture. It's all the same, but just sort of like a different flavor of ice cream. That's how these people think. So this is a very social science sort of, and if taken far enough, it can go into sort of like the arts. Um, you know, a lot of artists are extracultural. That's sort of like a big thing, especially in the modern day, of extracultural artists. And also just like people who are interested in fantasy can be in this region as well. Um, I think you get the idea. This is a very sort of liberalistic sort of region. So moving up to +2, what we have is systemic. So the systemic openness is people who are now fully aware that the world is made up of systems. These systems include people systems and they include thing systems. And in the mind of a +2, these are actually all going to seem as being interconnected. Um, and it's all going to be with a sort of mindset of progression, not necessarily progression as in, the stuff in the future is better than in the past. I mean, oftentimes it is, but sometimes it's more in a cartographic sort of sense of we're here now because we were at this other way of doing things in the past, and even further back we're at this other way of doing things. And people who are systemic, they're going to be fully aware of all the social systems in play and all the natural systems that are in play that led to the contribution of everything that you see in the world now, and they're also going to know exactly where it is going. Um, so there are people who are into spiral dynamics, people who are into doing conceptual models of large-scale systems, such as spiral dynamics and such as integral theory and such as the world values survey. All that stuff is systemic. I will go into the world values survey. It does relate to that, but I want to finish the continuum stuff first. So uh, people who are systemic, everything in their mind is seen as being part of an interconnected network that has all contributed, moving from the past to the future. They're going to be thinking about what humans will be doing thousands of years in the future, sort of like Isaac Arthur, this big YouTube channel guy. He's very systemic. Um, oh gosh, I'm sure there's others. I just can't think of them. But Isaac Arthur's awesome. Actually, you should definitely check out his channel. But that's something I shouldn't be. People who are systemic. It's all. It's all about. They're sort of, when taken to excess, they can be obsessed with models. They can be obsessed with trying to conceptualize everything in terms of this is arranged like this. This is where it is futureward. This is where it is pastward. And within any given instant in time, you can separate that into they'll have a grid-like framework of how everything is arranged within that particular group or that particular instant. There's there are 112 different types of X, and within those 112 different types, you can split those into 7, and within those 7, you can split those into 3 separate groups, and this group is used as, it has this particular function, it works well in this case, it doesn't work well in this case, this other group has this particular function, it works well in this case and not in this case. So that is how systemic people talk, that's how they think, and they're sort of like they'll be very up in the clouds. Um, they'll seem sort of like space cadets, oftentimes of that they'll come up with all these extremely novel, unconformist, fanciful ideas, and people lower on the continuum will be like, why are we even talking about this? This is all pie in the sky nonsense. We won't be doing any of this for 1,000 years. It's not relevant. That's how they'll often be received. And if they're even lower on the continuum, then people get very irritated by systemic thinkers because they'll be pointing out all the reasons why things are done the way they are and all the things that are currently wrong with how things are being done. And people who are like nationalistic are going to take serious issue with that. So moving up to the +3, the +3 region is called holistic. Holistic is people who realize that this is now moving beyond systems, because for holistic sorry about that. For holistic thinkers, even systems are now too close-minded, because when you make a system of something, you're assuming that everything in that system is isolated from everything else. And in a holistic thinker's mind, there's actually no barrier separating it from anything else. Everything is all the same object. It's all intimately connected with itself. It might be connected through an extremely large number of steps, but if there's a relation at all, then holistic thinkers are going to find that relation, and they're going to hold on to it, and they're going to find all the very deepest essences of this tradition that happened 3,000 years ago. Do you see all the stuff that we're still doing today that's like a spiritual successor of that tradition? They're going to be finding all the stuff that relates everyone and everything. The universe sort of has this like living, organic quality, because it all seems conscious. It all seems aware. It's everything. If it's taken to a very extreme, then oftentimes they can see the entire world as literally being like an extension of their own body. It's this is a very hard one to talk about, partly because even I don't fully understand it, but also because it's genuinely very hard to talk about. It's it's basically about the realization that you can't have any single object in the universe without it being connected in some sense to everything else in the universe. People who are holistic will often remind you you're intimately connected with everything else in existence, and if you try to shut yourself off into your own group, if you try to shut yourself off into just being an individual, people who are holistically oriented will always remind you that there's actually no separation between your body and the surrounding environment. There's no separation between you and other people, your interactions. Here's how they often think. Your interactions affect... Sorry about that. Your interactions affect everything that's around you. You talk to someone else, that person talks to someone else, and they talk to more people and so on and so forth. And because of that one conversation, you end up changing the entire world in some form or another, and every part of it, because the effects of that conversation bleed out. The person that you talk to is going to be doing things slightly differently than they would have otherwise because that conversation took place. The people that they interact with and everything they touch is going to happen slightly differently, and all that stuff. Is now slightly differently because they were interacting with that other person. And so this effect is sort of like the butterfly effect, or I mean, not sort of like, it is the butterfly effect, and it moves out and changes everything, however slightly, because of one minute interaction that you did at one point. This is how holistic thinkers think, or how they appear to. Everything is all one single interconnected object, and it doesn't make any sense to try to separate that object into isolated systems because they all interact with each other, however large or however small they are. So that's the holistic region. There are more regions above this, and +4 is what I refer to as non-dual, but on second thought, I don't think I'll be talking about that because I'm not sure I really understand that one very well myself. And it anyway, so that's the continuum stuff from -3 to +3. It took a while because it's a very complex and nuanced continuum, and for those of you who are knowledgeable in spiral dynamics, I am sure that you were easily recognizing which stages were after which region of the continuum. So the world value survey, just like with the H factor, and that had its own relation to a factor in the world value survey. The H factor related to survival versus self-expression, and the O factor relates to the other factor in the world value survey, which is traditional versus secular rational. So people who are more open-minded tend to become less traditional and more secular rational. Now, one caveat I need to mention here is that the world value survey, because of how the world currently is, it's only able to model a certain region of the openness continuum. And strictly speaking, it's not really even measuring openness. It's measuring the political analog of openness to experience, which is correlated with openness, but not the same thing. The correlation with openness and liberalism was, oh gosh, I saw it at some point. I think it's 0.4. It might not be exactly, there's something close to 0.4, but it's a noticeable correlation, but not that big. So for the traditional versus secular rational factor in the world values survey, you can definitely make the case that that cultures that are higher up on that factor towards secular rational are more open-minded, but it's not a given thing, and sometimes interesting things will happen. And another thing I wanted to mention is that, the way that the World Values Survey presents that factor is that the higher you go, the more secular rational you become. But what I don't think the people who do that model understand is that it's not, if they're secular rational, that's sort of like its own band of regions. So for secular rational, in terms of the continuum that I gave with respect to openness, I would say secular rational probably, it starts at the balance state at 0, and it goes up to +2. From +3 and onward, it actually, it is more open-minded, but there's certain things they happen. They realize certain things about the world that they're not really secular anymore, and they're not because they can't be. Now, I need to be clear. This isn't the same as like finding God or something. It's not any evangelical nonsense or anything like that. It's completely different. It's more that they appear to realize that the universe is alive and aware, and because of that, it's no longer really possible for them to remain secular. Now, some of them do, but a lot of them do not. And especially from +3 and onward, there's a very deep spiritual sense, not from any sense of conformity or trying to find values. It's more just from direct experience. Um, so for being secular and rational, it's more like that, sort of like a band within the continuum, just like a certain color on the color spectrum has a band within visible light. Secular rational has its own band. Traditional values have their own band. And it's true that uh, as you move in the positive direction from traditional, you'll go into secular rational. But when you continue moving in the positive direction, you'll move from secular rational into something else. It's not religion. It's just, I don't know if there's really even a word for it. It's just this sense that the universe is alive and aware, that everything is consciousness. So it's what I'm trying to say about the World Values Survey is that because of how the world is the way it is, it's only able to model a certain set of regions on openness and the H factor, and the way that it presents those factors is based only on those parts of the continuum that it understands. It doesn't fully understand stage yellow from spiral dynamics, and it has no concept of turquoise. And if you want to understand what I mean by abandoning the secular rational, I mean, it's not really abandoning. It's like transcending while including. They're still capable of all the rational thought, but now it's more wise, and it's with the understanding that logic really isn't everything. And probably the best way for you to understand what that means is just by looking at spiral dynamics. I myself have not yet done a video on turquoise because I don't fully understand it yet, but it is researchable as a model. I mean, stage turquoise itself, so it's something to look up on your own time. Now, I realize I've been talking about spiral dynamics a lot in this episode, even though trying not to, and it's important to understand that this episode it's about the openness factor, and openness is its own thing, while spiral dynamics is its own thing. But as a holistic thinker would tell you, those things are not isolated systems. They do communicate with each other, they are related, and they do correlate with each other. As someone becomes more conscious and moves up spiral dynamics, they tend to linearly increase in openness to experience. They also increase in the H factor generally, although the relationship between that is a bit more complicated. But it is true that as they become more conscious, they'll tend to become more high in H as well. So with traditional versus secular rational, it's that the emphasis becomes placed on do we allow people to think their own thoughts? Do we allow people to develop their own schema for the world? Do we are we requiring people to follow a certain tradition, or do we allow people to go with their own way of life, to pursue their own goals, pursue their own happiness? That's sort of the theme of secular rational. People who are toward tradition, they will emphasize the importance of religion, parent-child ties. They will defer to authority, and they'll be very focused on family values. They will also reject divorce, abortion, euthanasia, and suicide. And they will tend to have a nationalistic outlook and a sense of national pride. Well, if you move in the other direction, they will if you move towards secular rational, they will place less emphasis on religion, They will place more emphasis on maintaining a rational outlook. It's all about rational and trying to explain why the world is the way it is. They will tend to place less emphasis on the family, and because of that, you'll have a situation where after people are of a certain mature age, they will frequently leave the house so they can pursue their own job, their own career path, their own goals. They will be less concerned with uh, stopping divorce and abortion, and because of that, they will tend to be friendlier toward those sorts of things. Now, they'll also be more friendly toward allowing people to do suicide, but it needs to be mentioned, and I must strongly emphasize this, that people who are more secular rational do not more frequently commit suicide. Actually, the reverse is true. Because they're more open-minded and people are allowed to pursue their own goals, they tend to become a bit happier, and because of that, they are less likely to commit suicide, even though their society is more tolerant of it. So that's a very important thing to be aware of. So this has been a very long episode, but openness is a very complex and nuanced topic, and I realize it's been so long since I posted an episode, and that's because there's been a huge amount of stuff going on in my own life. I know in the last episode I said I'd post frequently, and I'm really, really sorry I was not able to do that. I cannot promise I will post the next episode in a timely manner. For one thing, it will be a new series. I'm going to be doing integral theory next. And also at some point I may revisit spiral dynamics because I was not very professional in how I did that series. And for some reason in this episode I stumbled a lot with the sub factors. I'm not sure why that is. I guess I thought I knew how to talk about them, and it turned out not to be the case. And I also just woke up. That might have something to do with it. I might have woken myself up in the process of talking. You know, I have to post these when I have the time to post it. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll try not to take an enormous amount of time posting the next episode, but I will post it when I can post it. Bye for now.